A Daughter's Inheritance, a novel by Geraldine Boyce, narrated by Becky Parker. Part 1. Violet. Violet Bailey stood behind a large chopping table laden with huge slabs of beef. She picked up a meat cleaver to divide them into more manageable portions before she began to cut them up with a sharp butcher's knife into the appropriate size for the day's stew. She had been doing this task since she was 12, when she had left Mr. Grayson's class, where she had learned to read, write, and add, in order to help her mother in the kitchen at the Craven Arms. Now 14, she still seemed too small to do this heavy work. The table came up almost to her developing breasts, but her solid, short body seemed to give a balance to the quickness of her movements while she worked. As the church clock struck 9, she cocked her ear for the first sounds of the army unit approaching with replacements for the changing of the guard at the harbor gate. The inn was located on Snargate Street, closer in to the town of Dover than the Grand Shaft, above which were the 1st Foot Guards Barracks on the Western Heights. When Violet heard the drums, she wiped her hands on her apron and pulled it off quickly. As she ran out, her long brown hair flowed behind, then rested on the well-filled, heavy tan cotton dress, a hand-me-down from her older sister, Ellen, who had grown too tall for it. "Don't go! You've got too much to do!" Mrs. Bailey called out after her. She turned to the 2 scullery maids. "That girl will be the death of me, and she'll be out again when they return this afternoon." "She has an eye for the young officer leading the guards," one of the maids said. "She'll have little chance of an officer noticing her," the other said. As the guards turned the corner of the street, Violet saw Lieutenant Oliver Hinton, and her heart warmed at the sight of him. She had noticed him as soon as he had arrived in town, and she knew she already loved him. As he marched by ahead of his men, eyes straight ahead, Violet saw him glance quickly upward. She followed his eyes to where the 18-year-old Ellen was standing at her bedroom window. She felt a swift pang of envy. "It isn't fair," she thought. "Ellen's tall, with golden tresses and a face of an angel, and besides, she's already engaged to be married to Arthur Mandell." In comparison, Violet felt shabby in the much-washed, faded work dress. She returned forlornly to the kitchen. "Hurry up and finish chopping," her mother said. "I've got to get more stew started. We've many mouths to feed before the afternoon ferry leaves." Mrs. Bailey watched her work, and soon all the beef was cut. "I shouldn't be hard on her," the mother thought. "She's a good worker. In truth, she's better than Ellen, who spends much of her time admiring her own reflection instead of making the beds. It'll be good when Ellen marries. Then her husband will have to clothe, feed, and buy her trinkets, and I'll be able to hire a new maid who'll do twice the work." It was the summer of 1815, when the Duke of Wellington's armies were waiting to do battle with those of Napoleon Bonaparte, for England and France were at war. Many British soldiers had already arrived in Belgium. Now officers' ladies were following them to attend numerous parties, which were being given in Brussels while waiting for the battles to begin. Their carriages delivered them to the ship hotel for their noonday meal and a rest, while their coachmen returned to the Craven Arms. With travellers constantly crossing the English Channel to and from Calais, and the army guarding the docks, Dover was crowded and busy. Compared to the other hotels in town, the Craven Arms was considered small and lowly, having only 4 double bedrooms for guests and 2 6-bedded dormitories, one for women, the other for men, on each of the 1st and 2nd floors. The 3 bedrooms on the 3rd floor housed the family of 5, the innkeepers, Mr. and Mrs. Bailey, their son, Noah, and their daughters, Ellen and Violet. It was a hot day, and the generously proportioned Mrs. Bailey perspired profusely as she quickly seared meat in a large pan on top of an open fire. On her right, a spit turned, roasting 3 legs each of lamb and pork. On the other side of the fireplace was a large oven, baking the day's supply of bread. After the oven cooled down, she replaced the bread with large dishes of rice pudding, which would slowly cook all day, coming out of the oven with browned skins on top for the evening meal. These joined her currant duffs and marmalade and golden syrup suet puddings, for which she was famous. Some might question the cooking of a heavy meal on such a hot day, but Mrs. Bailey knew her customers, couriers, carriage drivers, footmen, and salesmen going to the continent to ply British goods. They all preferred her hot meals so that they could soak their bread in her rich gravies. The inn's clients did not seem to mind the half-mile walk from the docks where they embarked or disembarked. They considered the inn good value for its clean rooms, good food, fine ales, and buxom serving maids. It was also a stagecoach stop en route to London, with horses for hire, which no attended, while Mr. Bailey managed the business and poured ale and porter from morning until closing time. Mrs. Bailey was in charge of the kitchen. Many an evening, Lieutenant Hinton came into the tavern with other young officers. One night, a serving maid called through the open kitchen door, "One of the officers wants a dish of beef stew." Mrs. Bailey, busy at the stove, called over her shoulder, "Violet, get a tray ready. Spoon some into a bowl for him, slice some bread, and take it in." The lieutenant was sitting at a table waiting for it. "Ah, here's the famous beef stew. Set it here." Violet set the plate down in front of him. Then, laughing, he swung around and grabbed her. "You're a pretty morsel," he said, pulling her onto his knee. Violet, surprised, looked at him. He was so handsome, with his dark brown curly hair, a face that narrowed into a pointed chin, and a dark face, which might have been naturally that color, or might have been browned by parading in Dover's sunshine and ocean sea breezes. She knew it was not proper to remain there, and she tried to pull away, but he held her tighter. She again struggled to rise as his friends joined in his laughter. "Look, she's blushing. She must be a virgin. That makes her even more of a treat." A major walked over and said, "Leave her alone, Hinton. She's too young for you." The lieutenant let her go, and without a word he turned and began to eat his stew. "What's a virgin?" Violet asked when she returned to the kitchen. "You shouldn't be asking questions like that," her mother scolded. The scullery maid looked at her and said, "A virgin's a girl untouched by a man." "Well, then, I'm not a virgin," Violet thought, "because I've been touched by a man." And she hummed happily to herself as she worked. Rumors, overheard by Mr. Bailey at night, changed daily, but it was more likely only days rather than weeks before the first foot guards would leave. When a group of officers came in a few days later, it was common knowledge that it was their last night, for the regiment had orders to sail the next morning. The drunker he got, the more aggressive Lieutenant Hinton became with the serving maids. Carousing more loudly than usual, he and his friends stayed until closing time before staggering out onto the street. Violet watched them through the dining-room door, then sadly turned back to serve her diners. The group of officers, arms around each other, continued singing as they went down to the corner of the street. The lieutenant stopped suddenly, turned around, retraced his steps, and entered the inn's main hallway, where lit candles had been placed in sconces at the bottom of each flight of stairs to lead guests up to their rooms when they retired for the night. Holding onto the banister to steady himself, he climbed to the 3rd floor. Remembering the room from which Ellen looked out at him each morning, he banged loudly on the door. He heard a rustling in the room and knocked again. When Ellen opened the door slightly, The lieutenant pushed it open, walked in, took a ring off his little finger and gave it to her.
"Arthur!"
Ellen shrieked, dropping the ring. "I've got to see you one more time," the lieutenant said, slurring his words. "I'm leaving for France." But before he could finish, Arthur Mandel gripped him by the collar, threw him out of the room onto the hallway floor, kicked the ring after him, and slammed the door. Lieutenant Hinton lay there cursing. He was not used to being denied anything he wanted. He got up slowly and started down the stairs. Violet, coming up to bed after working hard all day, met him on the second landing. She stood aside to let him pass, but instead he pushed her to the wall, and in a manner which indicated, even in his drunken state, that he was adept in this procedure, he reached under her skirts, pulled down her pantaloons with one hand, unbuttoned his trousers with the other, and entered her. Violet gasped at the pain. His face came close to hers, and he explored her open mouth with his tongue. She had daydreamed that he would kiss her, but not like this. She could taste the beer on his breath. He groaned as he climaxed, remained inside her for a moment, then withdrew, straightened his clothing, and continued staggering down the stairs. Violet sank to the floor. It had all happened so quickly. She did not know what to think. She felt injured, misused, and exhausted, yet confused, because he must have wanted her. When she felt able, she got up, pulled up her pantaloons, straightened out her skirt and petticoat, and slowly pulled herself up the banister to the third floor. Upon reaching the landing, she stepped on something uneven. She looked down and saw it was a man's gold signet ring. She picked it up and put it in her pocket. When she entered the bedroom she shared with Ellen, Arthur jumped up quickly. "You look a terrible mess," Ellen said. "What have you been doing?" Violet looked down to the floor. "Nothing." "She's been working hard all day," Arthur said, kindly, kissing Ellen. "I'll go. I'm sure she wants to go to bed." Violet lay on top of her bedcovers and waited for Ellen to get into bed. When she was sure her sister was asleep, head turned to the wall, she got up and lit a candle, poured cold water from the water jug into the basin, removed her underwear, and began to wash the stickiness from between her legs. Noticing that her beige pantaloons were bloody, she rinsed them, wrung them out tightly, and threw them under the bed to put into the wash trough the next morning. When she had finished, she opened the window and emptied the basin water onto the street below. She removed the ring from her skirt pocket and looked at it. The initials engraved on the outside were O-E-H, and on the inside were the words, "Love, Mother." She opened the second drawer in the chest she and Ellen shared and took out a small black box in which she kept her treasures. She opened it, looked lovingly at the few trinkets in the box, and added the ring, then put the box back in the drawer and quietly closed it. After putting on her nightgown, she climbed into bed and lay there thinking. Despite still hurting, she had a strange feeling of elation. Ellen's not the only one to have a lover, she thought. Brigadier General Dashwood Danby paraded next morning in full uniform regalia, followed by the regimental band and his 1st Foot Guards Regiment, as he proudly led his 1,000 men to war. Watching in a crowd of local bystanders lining the streets, Violet hoped that Lieutenant Hinton would glance in her direction as he marched ahead of his unit, but he looked straight ahead. She prayed for his safe return. Couriers from the Duke of Wellington often stopped for ale and a meal at the Craven Arms on their way to deliver messages to the government in London. Mr. Bailey listened to their stories of the numerous parties being held. On the day of June 14th, the messenger stopped for a pint of beer and to hire a horse to take him to London. "There's a big ball being given in Brussels tonight by the Duchess of Richmond," he said. "Why are they wasting time on all these balls while battles are waiting to be fought?" Mr. Bailey asked. "I'd rather they fight and get this war over with." The messenger settled his leather pouch on his shoulder and drained his glass. "I must be off," he said, as he went outside to mount the horse that Noah was holding for him. As the days passed, more news reached England. It appeared that Lady Richmond's ball had not delayed the battles, but perhaps had given the enemy spies a false impression that the Duke of Wellington was occupied for the night. In actual fact, after being given the news that Napoleon was approaching from an unexpected direction, he had left the ball early, and after 2 hours' sleep had gone straight to the headquarters to review his plans to best offset the enemy's approach. He decided to make his stand closer to Brussels, while his allies, the Prussians, would be attacking from the south on the banks of the rivers Sambre and Meuse. The first Foot Guards were immediately deployed to mass at Quatre Bras. There had been a terrible rainstorm on the march there, which had turned all roads into rivers. In his misery, as he marched, Lieutenant Hinton thought back as to why he had joined the army. He was already 20 and had not yet settled to any career when his 3 older brothers had suggested to their mother that he join the local Bedfordshire regiment. Lady Hinton, however, more ambitious for her youngest son, preferred that he apply to the more elite Royal Horse Guards. When he was refused, he applied to the King's Dragoon Guards, and again he was turned down. He learned that the First Foot Guards needed men, and for lack of anything better to do, he joined up. His mother bought him his commission. Now, 22, he was going to war for the first time. Word had reached the British that the Prussians had been quickly vanquished by the French, who now planned to attack them and a small contingent of Dutch and Belgian allies. Orders were for each officer to assemble his unit of men behind them, then, with swords drawn, lead them into battle. The lieutenant could see the French cavalry gathering in the distance. As the size of their massing continued to grow, Lieutenant Hinton became more terrified. He could feel the sweat running down his back. When the captain gave the order to advance, he wanted to stop and turn back, but he could not because his men, obeying their orders, pushed him forward. As horses galloped towards them, he saw a mounted French officer above him raise his sword and felt the hard blow to his neck. His head, still attached by only a tendon, hung to one side and weighed him down until he toppled over and sank into the mire. During the next 3 days of fighting, each country's armies advanced and retreated many times. In the end, it was the charge of the Scots Greys, with bagpipes blaring, that won the day for the British and their allies. Mr. Bailey, washing his glasses late at night, saw the courier come in. "I'm glad this is the last time I'll be passing through on my way to London," the courier said. "Tell me about it. Here's a pint on the house." "Thanks, I need it. I usually leave my message for the Duke of Wellington at headquarters, but this time my orders were to deliver it directly to him." The courier stopped to take 2 gulps of ale and wiped the froth from his mouth with his coat sleeve. He had gone off alone on his steed to revisit the battlefields. I galloped up the slope to where the last battle was fought, and when I reached the top I saw such a sight that will sear my soul forever. "I hear it was a bloodbath," Mr. Bailey said. "The Duke sat slumped on his horse in the middle of the dead, some piled high on top of each other, where the 2 armies must have met. The rest lay covering the ground as far as the eye could see." "I didn't think generals worried too much about how they won wars," Mr. Bailey said. "I urged my horse to go forward, and his hooves sank into the mud, red with blood, until I reached the Duke. I handed him the packet. He read it, then turned to me and said, 'The Prime Minister is congratulating me on winning the war.'" He waved his arm forward as if to say, "Look what has been wrought." He put the missive in his pocket and rode off, picking his way between the dead. I heard that half the French army was killed, and 50,000 of all those who had fought in those few days. Regardless of the carnage, England rejoiced at Wellington's victory. Many towns had victory parties in the streets. Dover staged its celebration below the castle wall, with Morris dancers performing on the grass. But then the truth of the war's devastation became more evident. A field hospital was to be built outside the town to handle the high number of wounded who were well enough to be brought back to England. Of the 1,000 men whom Brigadier General Dashwood Danby had so proudly led to the ships just days before, only 300 returned. As the survivors marched back to their quarters, disheveled and weary of war, Violet watched anxiously, then ran alongside them, calling out, "Has Lieutenant Oliver Hinton returned with you?" Most of the men, sunk in their own misery, did not bother to answer, until a kindly sergeant, taking pity on her agitated state, called back to her, "No, missus, he got it in the first day of battle." Violet stopped running. She felt she had received a great physical blow and was overcome with nausea. She slowly returned to her room to mourn alone. Later, talking to her husband, Mrs. Bailey shook her head. "She's taken Lieutenant Hinton's death so hard, but how can she be so unrealistic? He never took any notice of her. Even if he had survived, did she really think that anything would have changed?" "I know, but she has always been a dreamer," her father said. Business at the Craven Arms flourished as travelers and soldiers returned home from the continent. When after a few weeks it began to slow down, the respite was welcome, for preparations for Ellen's and Arthur's wedding in late September had begun. Violet was to be the only bridesmaid, but in her sadness she could not work up any enthusiasm for it. She got scant pleasure from having a new dress made for the occasion. She went with her mother to Mandel's drapery and dry goods shop to choose the material. Arthur, who worked for his father, served them. Violet found the array of silks and satins beautiful, as she had always worn muslin for best. "Don't waste your time looking at them," Mrs. Bailey said quickly. "Come and look at this pretty pink cotton with the dark red rosebuds. Why don't you buy some ribbons to go with it?" she added kindly, in an effort to raise the girl's spirits. "You can deliver the material to Miss Arnold tomorrow. She'll take your measurements, and be sure to ask her to allow extra seams for shrinkage." After a few days, Violet returned for a fitting. She eased into the dress, then turned around for the seamstress to button up the back. "That's strange. It's tighter than it should be," Miss Arnold said. "You must have gained weight. Well, no matter. I left plenty of seams, just as your mother asked. Come back in 3 days and it'll be ready." Her mother accompanied Violet on the next visit so that she could view Ellen's wedding dress, which was hanging in the fitting room. "It's lovely," she said, looking at it, then turned to help Violet try on her dress. As she began to button it up, she remarked, "It seems rather tight, Miss Arnold." "It can't be. I let it out after the last fitting. Let me see." She stepped forward to inspect it herself. "Mercy, it's tight again, especially around the waist. You must be eating too much, Violet." "Can you let it out again?" Mrs. Bailey asked. "Yes, but it won't leave much room for shrinkage." When they got back home, Ellen was waiting for them. "Isn't my dress the most beautiful you've ever seen?" "Yes, dear, it is. I love the lace sleeves and edging around the hem." In truth, Mrs. Bailey considered the dress too fancy. In their class, brides now did not dress up much for weddings, often just buying a new pretty bonnet to wear with their best dress. But she didn't want to say anything, for Ellen had her heart set on this pattern, and, of course, the Mandels had let them have the material at a special price. "But Violet's dress has to be let out again," Mrs. Bailey continued. "She seems to have gained some weight." "Oh, dear! I don't want you looking like a tub following me up the aisle at my wedding." After changing from their going-to-town clothes, both Mrs. Bailey and Violet returned to their kitchen chores. "You've been looking a little peaked lately, Violet. It's strange that your appetite isn't what it used to be, yet you're getting fatter. Perhaps I should take you to see Dr. Wilson." "Oh, no, Mother, I'm quite well." Actually, she wasn't well, and she couldn't understand it at all. Usually full of energy, she felt listless and tired. Although a busy woman, Mrs. Bailey had always tried to be a good mother. Within a few days, she decided that Violet should accompany her to Dr. Wilson's morning surgery. After he examined Violet, he turned to her mother and said, "Please come into my office while Violet dresses." After closing his office door, he said, "Mrs. Bailey, please sit down. I regret to tell you that Violet is with child." Mrs. Bailey was aghast. "Oh, no, Doctor, you must be mistaken. She's only 14 and hasn't been with anyone." "But I assure you that there is no doubt about it. She's almost 3 months along, I'd say." Mrs. Bailey burst into tears. "How could that be?" she cried. "My poor little girl! What are we going to do?" Dr. Wilson said gently, "First, you will have to find out how it happened. I am as concerned as you. I brought her into the world, as you well know." Mrs. Bailey questioned Violet persistently and learned of the night on the landing with Lieutenant Hinton. She dreaded telling the family, and it was a week before she could pluck up courage to do so. After they had all finished their night's work, she called the family together in hers and Mr. Bailey's bedroom. They all listened quietly, except Ellen, who fumed, "This disgrace will ruin my wedding." "No one will know until after the wedding," her mother said quickly. "You little fool!" Ellen shrieked. "He had come up to my bedroom to see me, but luckily Arthur was there and threw him out." "I thought he wanted me," Violet said piteously. "How could you be so stupid? Of course he didn't. He wanted me, but I wouldn't have him. He tried lots of times." "I don't believe you." "He raped you in anger because he couldn't have me." Noah went over and put his arm around his little sister. "If he had come back, I'd have beaten the daylights out of him." He then turned on Ellen and said, "You're lucky you aren't in the same boat as Violet, the way you've been acting with Arthur." "No need to insult me!" Mr. Bailey spoke up at last. "Enough! Stop your bickering. We have a serious problem, and we've got to decide how to handle it." "But what are we going to do?" Mrs. Bailey asked, weeping. "Is there any way we can get rid of it?" Mr. Bailey asked. "How far along is she?" 3 months. "So there's still time," Ellen said. "It can be dangerous," Mrs. Bailey said. "I won't have her going to the back streets." "Are there any potions, Mother?" Mr. Bailey asked. "I don't know, and they often don't work anyway." Violet, who had been standing there quietly, spoke up. "I don't want to get rid of my baby. I want to have it." The family turned to look at her. "You don't know what you're saying," Ellen said. "Think of the disgrace, not only for you, but for the whole family." "I don't care what the disgrace is. I want to keep the baby," Violet said again. "But how can you?" her mother asked. "I'll go away and get a position in a small house as a maid and take my baby with me." "You don't know if you could get such a job. It would be a hard life, Violet," Mrs. Bailey said, beginning to cry again. "You're being ridiculous and selfish," Ellen said. "No, I'm not," Violet said tearfully. "I just want to have the baby and keep it and love it." We have no relatives for you to stay with to have the baby, and you couldn't work very much here, looking after the baby and all," Mr. Bailey said.
"Yes, I could. I promise you."
Mr. Bailey looked at his wife. "This is something we can't decide tonight. We'll have to think about it some more. Perhaps you could make a few inquiries, Mother."
"I'll talk to Dr. Wilson again."
But Dr. Wilson was not of much help. "This is a tragedy. Such a lovely young girl to be so ravaged. But of course I can do nothing, and the alternatives are dangerous." Mrs. Bailey sighed and got up to leave.
"Then it looks as if you'll be bringing Violet's baby into the world, just as you did her,"